The final candle in the great archive has been lit. The dust of 1,000 years brushed softly away. The noisy world outside these stone walls is gone. The noisy world outside these stone walls is gone, making room for the quiet stillness of time. Let your breath slow and follow the ancient ink glowing in the firelight. Here, in the deep hush of this library, where the shelves rise higher than candlelight can reach, and the scrolls sleep in their cedar cases like seeds waiting for a forgotten spring. There is a particular tome I have been meaning to open for some time. It is not the largest volume in this collection, nor the most elaborately bound, though its cover is aged to a colour that exists somewhere between green and grey, and the particular darkness of deep water seen from above. The leather is soft in the way that very old things become soft, worn by the passage of hands across centuries, by the attention of readers who came before me in candle-lit rooms not so different from this one, who turned these same pages in the same quality of silence, and felt, as I feel now, the slow, welcome weight of very old stories settling around them like a cloak. I will open it carefully, here at my desk, while the oil lamp breathes its small light across the parchment, and the shadows of the archive arrange themselves in their familiar, companionable way along the walls. Outside these walls, the world continues its noise and its urgency and its relentless motion. But in here, there is only this: the lamp, the page, the ancient words beginning to glow as my eyes find them, and a story that has been waiting with great patience for exactly this hour. The story comes from the green island at the western edge of the known world, the island that sits where the maps run out and the ocean continues its vast, grey, uninterrupted journey toward whatever lies beyond. The ancient scholars who wrote about it described it as a place of mist and remarkable greenness, where the rain came not in the sharp, violent way of storms, but softly, persistently, the way a memory comes, settling into the grass and the stone and the dark soil until everything was saturated with a particular quality of quiet life. The Romans knew the island and wrote about it in their measured way, but they never quite crossed the water to it, and perhaps that is why the oldest things there remained oldest, undisturbed by the machinery of empire, preserved in the amber of oral tradition and the careful hands of scribes working in candlelit rooms on lonely hilltops above grey seas. The island is Ireland, and the story I am holding tonight, here in these pages where the ink has faded to the colour of dried autumn leaves, is the story of the people who lived within Ireland's hills, not inside them in the manner of tunnels or mines, not burrowed there by necessity or poverty. Inside them, in the way that another world is inside this one, folded into the same geography, existing alongside the mortal realm and yet entirely distinct from it, separated by a boundary so thin that in certain hours of certain days, particularly in the slow blue-gold twilight of autumn or the charged electric dawning of early summer, the boundary became permeable and a person walking alone across a green hill might feel, without being able to explain it, that something was very close and very attentive and very old. The people within the hills were called the Aos Sí. The words are Old Irish, and they mean, simply and profoundly, the people of the mounds. In the later writings, in the manuscripts preserved through centuries of copying and recopying, of monks bending over vellum in the grey light of small windows, the Aos Sí became the fairy folk, became the good people, became the hidden ones, the names shifting across time as names do when a tradition is very old and has passed through many languages and many centuries of telling. But behind all the names was the same understanding, the same quiet acknowledgement that the hills of Ireland were inhabited by presences older than memory, and that these presences deserved a particular quality of respectful attention. Before they were the Aos Sí, before the fairy mounds and the folklore and the careful rules of hospitality and boundary, they were something else entirely. They were gods. The ancient traditions of Ireland record their name with a certain weight that the later centuries tried to soften, as if the fullness of what they were had become too large a thing to hold in ordinary speech. The Tuatha Dé Danann, the tribes or peoples of the goddess Danu, though that name itself is disputed in the oldest scholarship, argued over in the margins of manuscripts by scribes who could sense the argument mattered even if they could not resolve it. They arrived in Ireland, the myths say, in ships, or perhaps not in ships, but wrapped in clouds, descending out of the northern sky with the unhurried inevitability of weather. They were tall and luminous, and possessed of capabilities that the mortal mind encountered as magic. Though the distinction between magic and a deeper knowledge of how things work has always been, in my experience of these archives, more a matter of perspective than of fundamental difference. They brought with them 4 treasures of extraordinary power, and these treasures are recorded in the oldest texts with the kind of careful, reverent specificity that scribes reserve for things they believe to be genuinely real. There was the spear of Lugh, which never missed its mark, and from whose wound no one could recover. There was the sword of Nuada, which could cut through anything in the world, and against which no defence existed. There was the cauldron of the Dagda, which could feed all who approached it without ever being emptied, the great giving vessel of abundance and sufficiency. And there was the stone of fall, the stone of destiny, which cried out beneath the feet of the rightful king of Ireland, its voice rising from the earth itself to confirm the legitimacy of rule, to say, in the language of stone and earth and deep time, that this person, standing here in this moment, was the one the land chose. They ruled Ireland for a long age, the Tuatha Dé Danann, an age that the ancient texts measure not in years precisely, but in a quality of duration that the word age only partially captures, a time long enough for the hills and rivers to become associated with their names, for certain mountains to carry the memory of certain deeds, for the landscape itself to become a kind of living record of everything that had occurred within it. The sky above Ireland and the soil beneath it absorbed the presence of the Tuatha Dé Danann the way very old stone absorbs warmth, slowly and completely, until it is impossible to say where the stone ends and the warmth begins. Then the Milesians came. They came from the south and the west, mortal men from a distant shore, descendants, the ancient histories claim, of long wandering through many lands, carrying with them their languages and their customs and their considerable determination. They came to Ireland across the grey Atlantic, and they landed on its shores, and they looked at the green hills and the wide rivers and the particular quality of the light, which is like no other light in the world, soft and lateral and somehow intimate, as if the sky there is closer to the earth than elsewhere, as if the island exists in a slightly different relationship to the sun, and they decided that this was where they would remain. There was battle. The ancient accounts recorded with the efficient gravity that very old texts bring to the description of large, inevitable events. And the battles were real in the way that the myths record battles, which is to say, they were also metaphors, also the working out of forces larger than any individual combatant, also the expression of something about the nature of change and succession and the passing of one order into another. The Milesians prevailed on the surface of Ireland, which is to say, in the world of sunlight and weather and the visible turning of seasons. But the Tuatha Dé Danann did not perish. They did not flee. They negotiated something that the mortal mind, accustomed to the binary of victory and defeat, does not always know how to categorize. A withdrawal that was also a continuation, a retreat that contained within it the entirety of what had come before. They went beneath the hills. They went into the green, rounded mounds that rose from the Irish landscape like sleeping breaths. The ancient earthen structures built by the people who had lived in Ireland before even the Tuatha Dé Danann, the enormous passage tombs of the Neolithic people who align their interior chambers with the rising sun of midsummer or the dying light of the winter solstice, who understood the relationship between the earth and the sky as something that deserved architectural expression. These mounds became the Sí, the dwelling places of the hidden people, the portals between the world of mortal days and the world of eternal things. The word itself is ancient, derived from a root that means something like dwelling or seat, the specific kind of seat that implies permanence, implies that the one seated there has always been seated there and will continue to be so after everyone watching has come and gone. Some scholars of the Old Tongue have connected it also to words that mean lasting, perpetual, the quality of enduring beyond the ordinary span of things. The 17th century Scottish minister Robert Kirk, who spent his quiet professional life in a small parish in the Scottish Highlands, and who compiled with remarkable diligence everything he could learn about the fairy folk of the Celtic world, described them in his treatise with a care that comes from genuine curiosity rather than dismissal. He called their collective existence a commonwealth, a word that implies governance, implies law, implies a society with structure and reciprocal obligations, and the recognition that individual existence happens within a larger ordering of things. He described them as intelligent, fluidous spirits, existing in a middle nature between man and angel, neither entirely one thing nor the other, neither fully bound by the limitations of mortal flesh, nor entirely free of the gravity of the earthly world. They had bodies of a kind, he wrote, but bodies of a different consistency, light and changeable, capable of assuming forms that the mortal eye received as beautiful or terrible, depending on what the fairy folk wished to communicate by their appearing. And they had laws. This is the detail that I find most quietly significant. Sitting here in the archive with a lamp breathing its slow light across the page. Not the elaborate ceremonial laws of courts, not the written codes of empires, but something older and more essential. The understanding that every world, however hidden, however far beyond the ordinary cartography of human experience, is governed by rules of conduct, by a sense of what is owed between beings who share a landscape, even when they inhabit different layers of it. The rural people of Ireland and Scotland, who lived alongside the Aos Sí in the most practical and immediate sense, who walked the fields every morning and worked in proximity to the fairy mounds and the lone hawthorn trees and the ancient ring forts that dotted the countryside, understood these laws with the pragmatic intimacy of neighbours, not the romantic intimacy of stories told at a safe distance, but the working knowledge of people whose livelihood depended on getting the relationship right. The hawthorn tree that stood alone in a field was not to be cut down. This was not superstition, as the later centuries would condescendingly characterize the old knowledge, but practical ecology, threaded through with something more. The recognition that certain trees were markers of a boundary, indicators of a place where the two worlds drew close together, and that to remove such a marker was to disrupt an arrangement that was not yours to disrupt. The lone hawthorn stood at its own crossing, between one kind of existence and another, and it was understood to stand there with purpose, with the patience of something that has been exactly where it is for a very long time, and intends to remain. The fairy ring was not to be entered carelessly. These naturally occurring circles of darker grass or clustered mushrooms, which appear in meadows after rain and seem to arrive out of nowhere with a completeness and a symmetry that the eye finds immediately significant, were understood to mark the places where the Aos Sí gathered in their celebrations. The sound of music that seemed to come from inside the earth, that drifted upward through the grass on certain nights when the air was still and the sky was very clear, was understood to be exactly what it seemed to be: the music of an older and more ancient celebration, continuing in the world beneath this one, unhurried by the passage of mortal time. The offerings were left without resentment, which is a detail that matters. A bowl of fresh milk set outside the door before sleeping, a portion of bread placed at the edge of a field, a small acknowledgement in the form of what one had and could give. Not tribute paid in fear, but something more like the gift given between neighbors who understand that their proximity is a shared condition requiring mutual attention. The morning light would come and the offering would be gone, absorbed back into whatever receiving existed on the other side of the threshold. And the household would feel, in the specific and wordless way that such things are felt, that the arrangement was being honoured. The festivals marked the permeability of the boundary most acutely. Samhain, the great festival at the end of October that divided the year as the year was then understood. The hinge between the harvest-lit half and the dark descended half was the night when the veil between worlds thinned to something nearly translucent. Not dangerous if approached with appropriate attention, not threatening if the rules were observed and the offerings were made and the lights were kept burning and the doors were marked in the old ways. But a night when the hidden world was very close, very present, when the hills seemed to breathe with a particular intention, when the darkness between one year and the next was inhabited by something that could be heard if you were very still and very patient and very awake to the quality of the silence around you. And here, in the archive, with the lamp burning low and the shadows of the shelves deepening around me, I find that I understand the appeal of that kind of stillness. The lamp speaks its quiet language of light and shadow. The scroll in my hands grows lighter as my grip on the waking world loosens. Gently, the way a hand opens in sleep, the way the body knows, even before the mind admits it, that rest is what the moment requires. The hills of Ireland are very green tonight, in whatever dimension of this story holds them. The mounds breathe slowly in the dark, their interior worlds continuing their ancient rotation of music and craft and the measured passage of an entirely different kind of time. The hawthorn stands at its crossing. The bowl of milk gleams palely in the last of the evening light at the edge of a doorway somewhere in the long ago. And from somewhere inside the earth, very softly, the way a sound comes when it does not wish to disturb anything, but cannot entirely keep itself from being heard. Something like music, something like the deep and patient warmth of stone that has held the sun all day and releases it slowly into the dark. Something that the ears receive as a beginning, and the sleeping mind receives as a door, and the body receives simply as permission to rest. The archive breathes. The lamp settles. The ancient page holds its words with great care, waiting for the hour when the reading can continue. The lamp has burned a little lower since last we rested here together, and the shadows in the archive have shifted in the way that shadows shift when time has moved through a room without disturbing anything in it. The way the quality of silence deepens, not by becoming emptier, but by becoming more complete, more settled into itself. The way a very old stone settles into the earth it rests upon, finding over centuries a perfect accommodation with the ground beneath it. The scroll is still open before me on the desk, and the ink that was amber in the earlier light has shifted now towards something darker, something that holds the candle flame inside it like a secret rather than reflecting it back. And there is another chapter waiting in these pages. Another corridor of the old knowledge opening gently outward from the last. We left the Aos Sí in their hills. We left them in the breathing quiet of the Sidhe, in their commonwealth of ancient law and domestic continuity, the spinning and the weaving and the patient maintenance of a world that exists alongside ours without requiring our attention to sustain it. Tonight, the scroll takes me deeper, not further into the landscape of Ireland's visible surface, the green hills and the morning mists and the stone walls running across the countryside like the sentences of a very long and unhurried story, but deeper into what the Irish mythological tradition understood to be beyond the hills, beneath the hills, past the threshold where the fairy mounds open into something that the mortal imagination has been reaching toward since the earliest days of the earliest telling. The Otherworld. The ancient Irish had many names for it, and this multiplicity of names is itself a form of knowledge, a recognition that a place of such complexity and such depth cannot be held by a single word, that the different names illuminate different aspects of it, the way different angles of light illuminate different facets of a stone, each revealing something the others leave in shadow. The land of youth, they called it in one breath. Tir na nog, the plain of honey in another. Mag Mel, the land of promise. Tir Tarngire, the land beneath the wave. Tir Fathin, the multicoloured place. Ildetach, the Isle of Apple Trees. Awen Ablach, each name a doorway, each doorway opening onto the same essential understanding, which is that somewhere beyond the edge of the visible world, beyond the boundary where the mortal eye runs out of things to rest on, there exists a place entirely free of the specific anxieties that make mortal life feel so effortful. The anxiety of time running out. The anxiety of the body wearing down. The anxiety of grief arriving without warning and staying far longer than anyone prepared for. The scholar Walter Evans Wentz, who spent long years gathering the living remnants of Celtic belief from the last communities where the old tradition still breathed in unbroken continuity, described the Celtic Otherworld as a radiant archetype of this world, the place where the mystic visionary sees nothing save harmony and beautiful forms. I have turned this phrase over in my mind many times in the quiet hours of the archive, and I find it grows richer with each returning. Not a world that is entirely unlike this one, not a paradise constructed from entirely unfamiliar materials, but a world that is like this one in its structure, in its green hills and its waters and its sky, while being freed from everything in this world that causes suffering. The same world, but held at its most essential, most luminous, most completely itself. It has no winter, the other world, or rather, it exists in a state of perpetual flowering that our world achieves only briefly. In those particular weeks of late spring, when the hawthorn is in blossom, and the air carries a warmth that has not yet become the heaviness of midsummer, when the light lasts long into the evening, and the evenings are the colour of honey, and the grass has reached its fullest green before the summer begins to dry it. It exists at that moment, always, the moment just before the perfection tips into its own ending, held there by some quality of the other world's fundamental nature that the mortal world cannot replicate, cannot sustain, can only approach in those brief seasonal hours and then lose again, as the season turns and the weeks carry the light away. There is no illness in the other world, the ancient texts agree. No treachery, no grief, no sorrow. And the absence of these things is not experienced as a hollow space where they might have been, but as a positive presence of their opposites, a fullness of ease and beauty and abundance, and the specific, sustaining peace that comes when the body is not afraid, and the mind has nothing to protect itself against. The food is inexhaustible. The music is continuous. The light is the particular light of a world that generates its own illumination from within, rather than borrowing it from a distant star. A soft and pervasive radiance that touches everything with equal warmth, that casts no harsh shadows because it comes from everywhere at once, the way warmth comes from a stone that has stored the sun across a long summer afternoon. The most famous of all the tales that describe a mortal's journey to this place is the story of Oisín and Niamh, which comes from the Fenian cycle of Irish mythology and has been told and retold across so many centuries and in so many forms that it has the quality of all truly essential stories, of something that exists not primarily in any particular version of itself, but in the resonance it leaves in the listener, long after the specific words have faded. Oisín was the son of the great warrior Fionn McCool, who led the Fianna, the elite warrior band of ancient Ireland, across decades of adventure and honour. But Oisín himself was not only a warrior, he was also a poet, which, in the ancient Irish tradition, was not a lesser or supplementary identity, but an equal one. The poet and the warrior understood as two aspects of a complete human being, two ways of engaging with experience and making it meaningful. He was riding with the Fianna one morning on the shores of Loch Lean in the west of Ireland, where the hills roll down to the water with the casual, unhurried beauty of landscape that has had long ages to arrive at its current arrangement. And the morning light was on the surface of the lake in the particular way that morning light lies on still water. as if the light and the water have an understanding between them, an agreement about how the beauty of the early hours should be distributed across a reflective surface. And out of the western mist, out of the direction of the sea, where the other world was understood to begin, a figure appeared that the ancient texts describe with a specificity that feels like memory rather than invention. She rode a white horse. The horse's name was Enbar, and it was not an ordinary horse, in the way that nothing associated with the other world is ordinary, though its extraordinariness was of a quiet kind, a quality of movement so perfectly fluid that the boundary between one step and the next was entirely invisible, as if the horse moved not through a series of discrete moments, but through a continuous present that the mortal eye could barely perceive. The mane of the horse was the colour of gold just turned from the furnace, and it moved in the morning air with the slow, autonomous motion of something alive in its own right, separate from the wind. The hooves, when they touched the ground, made no sound, or made a sound so subtle that it existed on the threshold between sound and silence, the way the first light of dawn exists on the threshold between dark and day. And the woman on the horse was Niamh, whose name in the old language means radiance or brightness, the specific luminosity of something that generates its own light. And the name fit her the way the most accurate names always fit, not as a label applied from outside, but as a recognition of what she already was from within. She was a daughter of the other world, a fairy queen, and she had ridden across the sea to the shores of the mortal world for a reason that the ancient storytellers understood very well. The reason that brings one world toward another most reliably across all the centuries and all the mythologies, which is the reason of love arrived for without warning, the recognition of one particular person among all others as the one who makes the distance between worlds feel surmountable. She spoke to Oisín, and the ancient texts preserve a version of what she said in the form of a song, a long, accumulating description of the land she came from, the land she was inviting him to, and the description has the quality of a lullaby, has the slow, rhythmic, building quality of something designed not to make the listener more alert, but more receptive, more open, more willing to follow where the words are leading. She described a country of perpetual youth, of hills always in flower, of a palace whose walls were made of a substance that caught and held light the way amber catches and holds the ancient insects within it, preserving them in perfect suspension across unimaginable durations. She described honey and wine and music and the company of a people who had lived long enough to understand that the quality of a moment is the only thing that endures, that the only truly lasting thing in any world is the depth of attention brought to what is beautiful in it. Oisín went with her. He went the way people go when something calls to the deepest part of them, in a language they did not know they understood until the moment they heard it. Without hesitation and without regret, turning from the familiar shore toward the western horizon where the sea met the sky in a long grey seam that the white horse crossed as easily as it had crossed the ground, the hooves finding the surface of the water and making of it something as solid and trustworthy as a meadow, as the great flowery plain that the otherworld spread beneath the waves for those who had learned to perceive it. Here I must pause in the reading, because this image stays with me here in the archive's hush. The sea as a meadow, the terrifying, immeasurable, uncontrollable ocean, revealed to the initiated eye as something else entirely, as a wide, fragrant, sun-warmed field full of flowers whose names have not been given in any mortal language, because they have grown there always without needing to be named, because naming is a mortal preoccupation, a way of securing knowledge against the fear of losing it, and in a place where nothing is ever lost, where time does not proceed toward the loss of things, but simply continues in its deep, unhurried fullness. The flowers have no need of names, and bloom nonetheless with great contentment. The Celtic god Manannán mac Lir knew this. He was the lord of the sea and the guardian of the passage between worlds, the ancient divinity who moved between the otherworld and the mortal realm with the ease of someone for whom the distinction is not a barrier, but simply a description of the route. When he encountered the hero Bran, sailing westward in his own great ocean voyage toward the otherworld, Bran saw the sea, as the enormous, heaving, grey-green danger it appears to any mortal vessel. Manannán, riding his chariot across the same surface, saw a tranquil plain covered in flowers, the Mag Mell, the delightful plain, where the chariot wheels rolled through the blossoms and left no track, because, in a world without loss, even the passage of a traveller leaves a landscape perfectly intact. This particular vision, this revelation that what appears as chaos and danger to one kind of perception is peace and solidity to another, is one of the most quietly profound gifts the Celtic mythological tradition offers to the mind that is trying to let go of its wakefulness, that is trying to cross the threshold between the rough surface of conscious anxiety and the smooth plane of rest that exists. The ancient stories insist, just beneath it, just on the other side of the perception shift, just past the place where the mortal eye gives out and something older and more patient takes over the navigation. Oisín lived in the otherworld for what he experienced as 3 years. The time there moved in the way time moves in the deepest possible rest, without urgency, without the sensation of being consumed, without the tick and the measure and the constant implication that each moment passing is a moment permanently departed. He lived in the palace of Niamh's father, in halls of light and music and the slow seasonal ceremony of a world that cycles through beauty without ever cycling into loss. And he was happy in the specific, total way that only people who have found exactly where they belong can be happy. Not the effortful happiness of someone working to sustain a good mood, but the baseline happiness of a creature in its proper element, as natural and unnoticed as the way a fish moves in water, as the way a root moves through dark soil toward the water table far below. When he returned to Ireland, when something in him pulled him back toward the mortal shore with the specific, irrational gravity of the place where one began, he stepped from the white horse onto the soil of Ireland, and 300 years fell upon him at once, gently but completely, the way a great tide falls back and reveals the shore it has been covering all along. Everything that the other world had held in suspension while he was there, all the time that had moved in the mortal world, while the other world kept him timeless, came to rest in his body in a single, absolute moment. And the young warrior became a very old man before he had taken his second step on the soil of his home. The tale is told as a tragedy, and it is, but it is also, if held from the right angle, in the right quality of light, a description of something deeply comforting. The other world held him perfectly, held him without aging, held him in the fullness of his strength and the completeness of his living, for the entire duration of his stay. The cost was paid not during the time of rest, but at the moment of departure from it, which is to say that the time in the other world was, for the duration of its being experienced, exactly what it appeared to be. Exactly rest, exactly peace, exactly the complete and sustaining relief of a world that asked nothing of the body but to inhabit it peacefully, and gave in return everything that the body and the mind required. The other great tale of the otherworld journey, the voyage of Bran, son of Firbil, begins in a way that feels designed for exactly this hour, and exactly this quality of half-waking attention that rests on the border of sleep. Bran was walking alone, as the ancient tale records it, in a place of ordinary quiet, and then he heard something. Not suddenly, not with the sharp intrusion of an unexpected sound, but gradually, in the way that music sometimes arrives from a great distance, assembling itself note by note from the general texture of ambient sound until the ear realizes it has been hearing something for a while without recognizing it as music, without separating it from the background of the world's ordinary acoustic life. He turned toward it. He turned away. It followed him, or rather, it surrounded him, because it was not coming from a single direction, but from the quality of the air itself. And wherever he moved within that quality of air, the music continued. And it was of such sweetness that the ancient text reaches for words and finds them only approximately adequate, describing a sound that no human instrument had produced, and no human tradition had prepared the ear to expect. A sound that moved through the body the way warmth moves through stone, pervading everything it touched, and leaving everything it touched more still than it had been before. He fell asleep to it. This detail is there in the oldest versions of the text, quiet and unelaborated, the most natural thing in the world. A man hears music of extraordinary sweetness, and he lies down and he sleeps. And when he wakes, there is a silver branch on the ground beside him, covered in white blossom, gleaming with the particular luminosity of a thing that has come from a world where everything gleams a little more than it does here, where the light is not borrowed from a distant source, but generated from within. The silver branch. I find it here in the archive's own light, described in the parchment with a care that suggests the scribe who copied these words believed in them, or believed in something close enough to them that the distinction did not matter. The care of someone preserving not a fiction, but a memory, however distorted by the passage of centuries and the imperfection of transmission from voice to ink. The branch is made of silver and covered in white blossoms and hung with golden apples, and when it is shaken, it produces a music that causes all who hear it to forget their grief, their anxiety, their accumulated weariness, to set those things down the way you set down a heavy bag when you finally reach the place you were carrying it to. The relief of the unburdening as simple and total as that. In the adventure of Cormac MacAir, the High King of Ireland, Manannán mac Lir himself brings such a branch, and the magic of it is described with the domestic specificity that the ancient Irish brought to everything they found truly important. The specificity that means, look closely, this matters. When the branch is shaken, the text says, its music casts sleep over all who hear it, not the uneasy interrupted sleep of a troubled mind, not the shallow surface sleep that leaves the body tired and the spirit unrested when morning comes, but something described implicitly in the completeness of its effect. The kind of sleep that makes people forget their woes and griefs. The kind that means when you wake from it, the weight that was on you when you lay down has lifted, or at least has become more possible to carry, more proportionate to your actual strength. Cormac is led through a magical mist into the otherworld, into a palace whose approach is described with the accumulating sensuousness of a narrative that understands that arrival is itself a pleasure, that the journey toward rest is already part of the rest. He finds a well shaded by 9 purple hazel trees, ancient and enormous, and draped in a stillness that is not emptiness, but attention. The stillness of very old trees that have been listening for so long that they have become something like listeners themselves, the bark taking on the quality of an ear, the leaves trembling not in the wind only, but in response to everything that moves through the air they inhabit. The hazelnuts fall from the branches into the well below, and 5 streams flow outward from the well in 5 directions, and the sound of these streams is described in the text as more melodious than any music that human hands have made. The sound of water that has passed through the roots of very old sacred trees and emerged carrying something of their deep, patient resonance. Inside the palace, everything is arranged for perfect comfort, in the way that only a world without error or accident, or the gap between intention and execution can arrange things. When Cormac is weary, his feet are washed by unseen, gentle forces. The warmth of the water precisely right, neither too hot for comfort, nor too cool for relief. The temperature maintained by heated stones that move autonomously into and out of the water, with a quiet efficiency that requires no attendance, no adjustment, no anxious monitoring. The water simply is what the body needs it to be, as if the world of the other world reads the requirements of whatever living thing inhabits it, and arranges itself accordingly, with the seamless, unnoticed perfection of a world that has had long ages to learn how comfort works. The banquet that follows is equally attended by this quality of effortless sufficiency. There is a cauldron of the Dagda whose abundance never diminishes, a great receiving vessel that gives and is never found empty. Because the other world's relationship to scarcity is simply the absence of scarcity. The way the other world's relationship to time is the absence of urgency. The way its relationship to grief is the complete, unwilled dissolution of every particular cause of grief, one by one, until the chest that has been holding them finally lets them go and finds itself lighter than it has been in longer than it can remember. The host sings Cormac to sleep at the end of the feast. This too is there in the ancient text, the lullaby as the final gift of hospitality, the voice settling into a rhythm that the body recognizes before the mind does, the rhythm of rest, of the breath slowing, of the awareness that has been moving through the world all day, beginning to gather itself gently inward, drawing back from the periphery, from the edges of perception, from the constant monitoring of the surrounding world for things that require response, and settling instead into the warm center of itself, into the place that does not need to respond to anything, that simply is. In the deep green of the other world, where the hazelnuts continue their slow fall into the sacred well, and the streams continue their melodious running outward in their 5 directions, and the trees stand in their ancient, patient listening, the light that is not borrowed from any sun, but generated from within the world itself, falls across everything with the particular softness of a source that is very close and very constant and very warm. And everything under that light, the grass, the water, the stone of the palace walls, the white blossoms on the branches of the apple trees, drifting slowly across the perfect air. Everything rests in it as naturally and completely as a sleeping form rests in darkness. Here in the archive, the lamp has not gone out, but it has grown quieter. Its small flame settled into something more ember than blaze, throwing its warmth more than its light. And the scroll before me holds its remaining words with great patience, waiting for no particular urgency, understanding that the rest of the reading will come in its own time, when the time is right. When the threshold between one part of the night and the next has been crossed with the ease of a white horse crossing a flowery plain. The hazel trees stand above their well. The streams run outward in their 5 directions. Somewhere in the western sea, the island of apple trees holds its eternal season of flowering, unobserved, unhurried, simply and completely there. And the archive breathes its old breath around me, the smell of cedar and ancient ink, and the dust of accumulated time drifting softly in the small warmth of the lamp. And the stone walls hold their silence as they have always held it, deeply and without effort, as deeply as the earth beneath them holds its own old patience. Rest. The lamp has found its quietest hour, not the hour of extinction, not the moment when the flame gives its last small shudder and the dark arrives completely, but the hour just before that, the hour when the flame has burned down through most of what fed it and now gives its light in a more concentrated, more intimate way, as if it has decided to spend what remains of itself not on illuminating the far corners of the archive, but on this desk, this page, this small warm circle of amber that holds the scholar and the scroll and the words between them in a pool of gathered attention. The shadows that were merely present earlier in the evening have now become inhabitants, occupying the spaces between the shelves with the settled ease of things that belong there, that have always been there, and are simply more visible now that the light has grown quiet enough to let them be seen. I have been turning pages slowly, here in the hush, and the scroll has brought me now to a passage that I have read before in other manuscripts, in other copies, made by other hands, in other candlelit rooms, across the long centuries of this tradition's preservation. And each time I return to it, I find something I did not find the previous reading. The way you find something different in a piece of music each time you hear it. Not because the music has changed, but because you have changed. Because the hour is different. Because the quality of attention you bring to it has been shaped by everything that has happened since the last time you listened. What I find in it tonight, in this particular hour of this particular lamp's quieting, is the thing I want to offer you now, here, at the edge of wherever the night is taking you. It is the story of a harp, not the harp as an instrument merely, not the harp as a technical achievement of wood and string and tension, though it was those things too, exquisitely and precisely those things in the hands of the craftsman who built it. But the harp is something older than craft, something that the ancient Irish mythological tradition understood to exist at the place where sound and the deepest structures of the world overlap, where the vibration of a string becomes something more than air moving in a particular pattern, and becomes instead a direct address to the part of the human being that exists below language, below thought, below the anxious monitoring of the conscious mind. in the place where the body knows things the mind has not yet been told, and responds to things the intellect has not yet categorized. The harp belonged to the Dagda, which is to say, it belonged to one of the most ancient and most fundamental of the Tuatha Dé Danann, the chief deity of the old Irish pantheon, whose name translates in the oldest scholarship as something like the good God. Not good in the moral sense primarily, but good in the sense of complete, of encompassing, of being adequate to every situation that arises. The way a perfect tool is good, the way a deep well is good, the way a house with thick walls and a warm hearth is good in the middle of a cold night. He was the father of gods and men, associated with the earth and its fertility, with the cauldron of abundance, with the great club that could both kill and restore to life, with the endless turning of the seasons, understood as a force not separate from the divine, but identical with it. And he had a harp whose name was Urna, which is one of the older Irish words, and carries within it a depth of meaning that translation only partially recovers. Something about the quality of resonance, about sound that does not merely travel through air, but inhabits it, changes it, leaves it different from what it was before the sound moved through it. The harp was richly ornamented, the ancient texts note, with the attention to physical beauty that the Celtic mythological tradition consistently brings to objects of genuine power, understanding that power and beauty are not separate categories, but expressions of the same underlying reality, that the things most capable of affecting the world tend also to be the things most beautiful to perceive. The wood was dark with age and handling, the kind of darkness that wood acquires when it has been in intimate contact with human hands for long enough, when the oils of many hands over many years have worked themselves into the grain until the wood and the human touch are no longer entirely distinct things. The strings were tuned to something that existed beyond the merely technical question of tuning, beyond the relationship of one string's tension to another's, into the deeper question of what the instrument as a whole was oriented toward, what it was listening for, what it was built to find and give back to whoever was in range of its sounding. The harp possessed, the ancient tradition records, the power to play 3 strains of music, not 3 songs, not 3 collections of melody that could be learned and performed and put down again like tools returned to their place. 3 states of being translated into sound. 3 fundamental human experiences rendered in vibration. 3 things the world does to us and that we do to ourselves, that the harp understood well enough to call forth and to shape and to direct, to amplify or to release or to guide toward their resolution. The first strain was the Suantraiges, the music of grief and weeping. I sit with this for a moment in the archive's quiet, because it is easy to misunderstand it, easy to read it as something dark or threatening in a story that is otherwise moving toward comfort and rest. But the ancient Irish tradition did not understand grief as the harp's most dangerous music. It understood it as one of the 3 essential experiences of being alive, as deserving of its own strain, its own mode, its own careful and unhurried sounding. The Suantraiges was not the sound of grief made worse, not an amplification of pain, but a recognition of it, a formal acknowledgement that the weeping needed to happen, that the body knew something the mind was still managing around, and that the harp's willingness to sound the grief strain was a gift. The gift of being met in the place where you actually were. The second strain was the Suantraiges, the music of joy and laughter. And this too is more complex than it first appears, because in the mythological telling, the joy is not a performance of happiness or an instruction to feel better. It is the natural result of the grief having been fully sounded, the opening that occurs when the thing that was being held has been released, the specific lightness that belongs to a body that has wept what needed weeping, and found, on the other side of it, that the world is still there and still holds the possibility of delight. The laughter that the Suantraiges produced was not the laughter of someone pretending the difficulty was not real, but the laughter of someone who had been through the real and come out the other side still breathing, still themselves, still capable of recognizing the beauty in the continuing fact of being alive. And the third strain, the one that I find myself holding most carefully tonight, turning slowly in the amber light of this quieting lamp, was the Suantraiges, the music of sleep. The ancient texts describe it with a restraint that is itself eloquent, that says more by saying less than a longer description could manage. When the Dagda played the Suantraiges, the text notes, he played so softly that it seemed it would not make a sound at all. This is the detail that stays with me across all the readings, in all the various manuscripts and copies and translations where I have encountered it. The detail that feels most precisely true to the experience it describes. The music of sleep is not the music of loud comfort or dramatic resolution. It is the music that exists at the threshold of sound and silence. The music that the ear receives not as a thing happening, but as the atmosphere within which things have stopped happening. The music that the body recognizes, not through the active pleasure of listening, but through the passive relief of having nothing left to resist. He played it in circumstances that the myth records with a storyteller's instinct for the meaningful juxtaposition. The Dagda's harp had been stolen by the Fomorians, those ancient, chaotic, destructive forces that the Celtic mythological tradition set in permanent opposition to the ordering, creative, beauty-making energies of the Tuatha Dé Danann. And the Dagda went to reclaim it, went into the camp of his enemies to recover the thing that was most essentially his, the instrument that was in some deep sense not separate from him, but an extension of him, an externalization of something he carried inside that the wood and string gave form to, made audible, made available to others. The Fomorians were there in their hall, enormous and loud and armed with all the confident menace of beings who have taken something and are comfortable in the taking of it. And the Dagda called the harp to his hands. This detail too is there in the ancient text, the harp summoned rather than simply picked up, the relationship between the instrument and its master, one of mutual recognition rather than ownership, the harp moving across the hall to his hands the way a sound moves through air, without apparent mechanism, through the medium of a connection that existed prior to the physical distance between them. He played the Suantraiges first. He played the grief strain, played it fully and without softening, and the Fomorian host, enormous and violent and entirely unprepared for this particular kind of engagement, found themselves weeping. They hid their faces in their cloaks, the text says, which is such a specific human detail that it stops me every time. That image of immense, supernatural beings pulling their cloaks over their faces in the presence of music that reached past every defense they possessed to the place inside them where grief lived, unacknowledged and unexpressed. And the grief came out because the harp gave it permission. Because the grief strain does not ask whether its subject wants to grieve, but simply opens the space within which grieving becomes possible, and then lets the body do what the body has always known how to do. Then the Suantraiges, the joy strain, rising from the grief the way morning rises from night, not by displacing it, but by following it, by being the thing that naturally comes next, when what came before has been fully given its due. The Fomorians laughed, wildly and uncontrollably, the laughter of beings who had not expected to feel anything at all in the presence of their captive's master, and found themselves feeling everything in rapid and bewildering succession. And then the Suantraiges played so softly that it seemed it would not make a sound, and every Fomorian in the hall, every enormous, chaotic, violent, destructive presence that the ancient Celtic imagination had assembled to represent the forces that work against rest and order and beauty, fell asleep. They fell asleep not in the aggressive way of beings struck down by a weapon, but in the helpless, total, fully surrendering way of beings who had no remaining resistance to the music, who had been moved through grief and through joy, and had arrived at the third place, the place where the body has been through enough that it simply lets go, where the will that has been holding everything together releases its grip because it has nothing left to hold with, where sleep is not a choice made, but a condition arrived at, as natural and as complete as the falling of night. The Dagda and his companions walked out of the Fomorian camp in the silence left by the Suantraiges, and the ancient text does not dwell long on this departure, does not elaborate the drama of their exit, because the drama was not the point. The point was the music. The point was the sequence of the three strains and what it reveals about the ancient Irish understanding of how rest is actually achieved, which is not by bypassing the difficult things, but by moving through them with sufficient honesty and sufficient care that they release their hold on their own, that the grief having been grieved and the joy having been felt, the body arrives at the third strain, not because it has been forced there, but because it has nowhere else to go. because it has done what it needed to do. And now the Suantraiges is simply the accurate description of where it finds itself. The harp's tradition did not remain in the realm of myth. It moved, as the most essential things always move, from the world of divine actors and cosmic events into the world of ordinary evenings and ordinary children needing to be carried from wakefulness into sleep, from the great hall of a god's instrument into the smaller, warmer, more intimate form of the Suantraiges, the Irish lullaby, whose name carries inside it the name of the Dagda's sleep strain, the way a river carries in its water the memory of the spring that fed it. The Suantraiges is one of the oldest continuous musical traditions in the Celtic world, preserved in oral transmission across centuries with the care that is given to things understood to be genuinely necessary, not decorative, not ornamental, not the luxury of prosperous times, but the basic and irreplaceable mechanism by which one generation carries the next across the threshold between waking and sleeping, by which the very young learn that the threshold is not dangerous, that the other side of it is simply more rest, simply the continuation of being held in a world that means them well. The rhythm of the traditional Suantraiges was not accidental. It was calibrated in the way that the most ancient practical knowledge is calibrated, through long observation of what actually works, through the accumulated understanding of what the body responds to when it is trying to let go of the day. The rhythm was slow, and it was regular, and it was built around something very close to the resting heartbeat, which is to say, it was built around the body's own deepest music, the percussion that runs beneath every moment of every life, from before birth until the last breath, the rhythm that the body knows more fundamentally than it knows anything else, that it learned before it learned language or memory or the difference between one thing and another. When the traditional Suantraiges matched that rhythm, when the voice of the singer found the pace of the resting heart and settled into it and held it there, the body of the listener recognized the invitation without needing to be told what it was being invited to do. The nervous system, which has been in a state of readiness all day, monitoring the surrounding world for things that require response, gradually found that it was hearing something that required no response. That was not information to be processed, or a threat to be assessed, or a demand to be met, but simply a rhythm offered without urgency, asking nothing back, and the monitoring could slow, and the readiness could soften, and the body could begin the long exhale of a day completed. The lyrics of the traditional Suantraiges wove through this rhythm, and they were, as the old tradition had it, steeped in the lore of the very world we have been moving through tonight, the world of the Aos Sí and the fairy mounds, and the other world beyond the boundary of mortal perception. The fairies were named in the lullabies, and the heroes of the old cycles, and the natural world in its specific Irish articulation of mountain and river, and the particular quality of the western light. And these namings were not merely decorative, but functional, part of the work of the lullaby, which was to locate the sleeping child, and the child about to sleep in a world that was very large and very ancient and very much on their side. A world that had been here long before them and would be here long after, and within which their smallness and their vulnerability were not threats to be anxious about, but conditions to be at ease with. The ease of something that is exactly the right size for the place it inhabits. Here, in the archive, with the lamp burning at its most intimate hour, I find that the Suantraiges has been doing its ancient work in the very rhythm of these words, in the way one sentence has followed the last, and the pace of the telling has slowed with each paragraph, in the way the sentences themselves have grown longer and more compound and more gently repetitive in their structures, not through any intention of my own, but through the natural drift of the late hour and the subject matter and the quality of attention that both invite. The drift toward the longer phrase, the softer verb, the return to stillness at the end of each extended movement of description. The lullaby tradition of the Celtic world was not the only form of acoustic enchantment preserved in these ancient stories. The Welsh branch of the tradition, from the great cycle of tales known as the Mabinogion, records another acoustic wonder that I find waiting in this section of the scroll, described with the same care and the same implicit understanding that certain sounds do things to time and consciousness that ordinary sound does not do. That the world of the Celtic Otherworld and its proximity to the mortal world has always expressed itself most reliably through what the ear can receive. The Birds of Rhiannon. 3 birds belonging to the Queen of the Otherworld, whose name is itself a condensation of an older divine title, the Great Queen, the Horse Goddess, the figure who moves at the boundary between the world of mortal consequence and the world beyond it. Her 3 birds are not described in the texts with particular attention to their appearance, to the colour of their feathers, or the span of their wings. Perhaps because their appearance is not the point of them. Perhaps because the ancient storytellers understood that these particular beings existed primarily in the dimension of sound rather than sight. That their essential nature was acoustic rather than visual, that what they were was what they sounded like, and what they sounded like was this: a song that could wake the dead and lull the living to sleep. The 2 actions together, held in the same breath, the same capacity, the same 3 birds, is a description of something that exists at the very centre of consciousness, at the place where waking and sleeping meet and touch and exchange their qualities, where the boundary between them is understood not as a wall, but as a membrane, permeable in both directions, available to be crossed by the right sound in the right moment. The Birds of Rhiannon could move a being from one side to the other, from sleep into waking, or from waking into sleep, with the same ease and the same essential indifference to which direction the crossing happened in, because for the Birds of Rhiannon, the crossing itself was the thing. The threshold itself was where they lived, and they sang from there with the authority of beings entirely at home in the liminal. Their song did something else, something that the ancient texts record with the careful specificity of people describing something they have actually experienced or believe has been experienced by people they trust. The birds' song altered the perception of distance. When they sang, they could appear to be very far away, while their song sounded close enough to touch. Or they could sound remote and misty and coming from the far edge of perception, while their physical presence was immediate, nearby, reachable. The spatial certainty of the waking mind, its confident sense of where things are in relation to itself, became fluid in the presence of the bird's song, became approximate, and then suggestive, and then simply a quality of the air, rather than a fixed description of the physical world. And the time. The bird's song altered time in the most precise and literal sense that the ancient tradition records. The 7 survivors of the war feast in the tale of Branwen, those 7 men who came through a catastrophic conflict, carrying everything they had seen and done and lost, sat at Harlech in the presence of the Birds of Rhiannon, and 7 years passed. 7 years that felt like an afternoon, felt like the comfortable duration of being deeply entertained, without any awareness of the mechanism of the entertainment. The way deep sleep feels when you wake from it. The way it has no interior duration you can account for. The way the hours simply occurred without your consciousness tracking them, leaving you with the residue of rest without any memory of the resting. The ancient texts do not present this as loss. They do not describe the 7 survivors emerging from those 7 years diminished or disoriented or robbed of time that should have been theirs to spend differently. They emerge sustained. They emerge having been held for exactly as long as they needed to be held, and the bird's song that held them was doing what the Suantraiges did, what the Dagda's harp did when it found the Suantraiges at its softest possible volume, what the Otherworld itself does in its essential structure and sensory abundance. It was providing the condition within which healing could occur without being sought, within which rest could be received without being consciously pursued, within which time could do its slow, patient work of mending the things that the waking, anxious, temporally aware mind cannot allow to be mended because it keeps interrupting the process with its monitoring, its measuring, its constant checking of whether the mending is happening fast enough. The birds sang from a distance that was also an intimacy. They sang from a time that was also a suspension of time. They sang from the border of the otherworld that is also the border of sleep, that thin and generous membrane between the world of consequence and the world of rest. And the men who heard them were simply held, as gently and as completely as that, simply held in the amber of the bird's song for as long as holding was what was needed. And somewhere in the singing, in the long, soft, distance-distorting, time-dissolving music that came from 3 birds belonging to a queen who lived at the threshold of worlds, The lamps of the hall at Harlech burned lower without anyone tending them, and the 7 men breathed more slowly without deciding to breathe more slowly. And the night moved through its hours with the unhurried patience of a night that has been given permission to take as long as it needs. Here in the archive, the scroll continues in my hands, and the lamp continues its quiet burning, and the cedar smell of the old cases drifts through the air with the particular warmth of a scent that has been the companion of many hours of reading in many years of this place's long life. And I find that my grip on the parchment has loosened, the way a grip loosens when the body is remembering something more important than holding. The birds of Rhiannon are singing somewhere just at the edge of hearing, just at the place where sound and silence agree to share the space between them, singing so softly that it might not be song at all, might simply be the quality of the air in this particular hour, might simply be what silence sounds like when it has been listening long enough to have learned a melody. The lamp breathes. The archive holds its ancient patience. The 3rd strain of the Dagda's harp drifts through the cedar and the ink and the accumulated quiet of 1,000 years of accumulated reading. And somewhere between one breath and the next, between one word and the word that follows it, between the lamp's current and its next, the threshold is there. And it is unguarded. And it asks nothing of the one who crosses it. Nothing at all. There is a particular quality to the archive at this hour that I have come to recognize across the long years of my keeping of it, a quality that arrives not at a fixed time, but at a fixed condition, when the last of the evening's purposeful reading has given way to something else, something that is not quite reading anymore, but not quite not reading either. The way the shore is not quite sea and not quite land, but is entirely itself, entirely its own kind of place, with its own kind of knowledge, its own relationship to what the tide brings and what it takes. In this condition, the words on the page seem to float slightly above the surface of the parchment, to hover in the small warmth of the lamp's last serious hour, and the meaning of them arrives not through the deliberate act of comprehension, but through something more passive and more total, the way warmth arrives when you have finally stopped moving and the room's ambient temperature can find you where you are and settle around you, quietly and completely, without announcement. The scroll has one more chapter. I can feel the remaining weight of it in my hands, the way a reader feels the last portion of a beloved text, with a quality of attention that is both more and less focused than what came before, more present to the individual word, more aware of each sentence as a distinct and irreplaceable thing, and simultaneously less tethered to the forward momentum of the narrative, less concerned with what comes next, more willing to rest in what is here, in this sentence, this image, this small and perfect moment of description, before it gives way to the next. What remains is the oldest voice in the Celtic tradition, older than the great mythological cycles with their gods and their heroes and their cosmic confrontations between order and chaos. older than the tales of otherworld voyages and fairy queens riding white horses across the surface of the sea, older than the lore of the Dagda's harp and the sociology of the fairy commonwealth and the systematic theology of the Sidhe and its relationship to the ancient earthen mounds. What remains is poetry, specifically the poetry of the early Irish monks, the men who lived in the 6th and 7th and 8th centuries in small stone cells on the exposed headlands and the rocky islands of Ireland's western coast, who bent over their manuscripts in the thin grey light of Atlantic mornings and wrote, in the margins of their theological texts and on scraps of parchment between one copying task and the next, the smallest and most precise observations of the natural world that any literary tradition has preserved. I have always been particularly fond of this material here in the archive. Among the grand mythological narratives and the elaborate genealogies of gods and the complex legal frameworks of ancient Irish society, the nature poetry of the early monks arrives like a change in weather, like the feeling of stepping from a large hall into the open air, a sudden expansion of the immediate, a sudden narrowing of scale from the cosmic to the particular, from the divine to the blackbird on its branch, from the war between gods to the sound of wind in the heather on a hillside above a grey and peaceful sea. These monks wrote in isolated places, the isolation itself a chosen condition, a deliberate retreat from the noise and complexity of the world, into a simplicity that was not poverty of experience, but a different kind of richness. The richness of attention undivided, of a mind that has removed the competition of many stimuli and given itself entirely to one thing at a time, to the quality of the light on this morning, to the sound of this stream, to the behaviour of this particular blackbird on this particular branch at this particular hour of a day that will not come again. In this, they were doing something that the mythological tradition had been doing all along, in its larger and more elaborate way. They were practicing the art of being fully present to what was immediately, sensually, undeniably there, and finding in that presence not the anxiety of the temporary, but the comfort of the complete. The scholar Kuno Meyer, who spent his scholarly life recovering and translating these poems from the Old Irish in which they were written, noted that the Celtic poet avoided the obvious and the commonplace with a consistency that was itself a kind of poetic principle, that they preferred always the half-said thing, the image offered at an angle, the detail chosen not because it was the most dramatic or the most easily legible, but because it was the most precisely true, the most exactly right, the detail that contained within it, if held with sufficient attention, the whole of what the poem needed to say. In this, the monks were doing in their small, marginal poems what the whole tradition had been doing across the vast expanse of the mythological cycle, finding the particular image that opens into the universal, finding the single blackbird or the single hazelnut falling into the single well that contains within it the whole of what it means to be a creature alive in a world of other living things. I have one such poem before me now, here at the desk, in the last warmth of the lamp's serious light, and I will not read it aloud in its original Irish, because the old language in my speaking of it would be less than it deserves, would be a translation of a translation, the meaning of the words arriving at your ears already twice removed from its source. But the image in it, the essential image that the monk set down in his small stone cell on his rocky island, with the Atlantic wind against the walls and the grey sky pressing its weight against the small window above his desk. This image I can offer in the language of this hour, in the language that fits itself to the quiet, the way the quiet fits itself to the stone walls of the archive, naturally and without effort. He was describing evening, the specific Irish evening of a specific day in a specific season, probably autumn given the qualities he noted, the particular gold in the light, the shortening of the available hours, the way the shadow of the hill moved across the monastery's small garden earlier than it had moved a month before, and would move earlier still by the time the winter solstice arrived to mark the year's deepest dark. He noted the colour of the sky above the western sea, which he described not as a single colour, but as a quality that shifted between colours without settling in any of them, the way water shifts between colours, the way the surface of things shifts when the light on them is itself in motion, in the slow motion of the sun's descent through the atmosphere above the horizon. He noted the sound of the wind, which, on the western headlands of Ireland, is rarely entirely absent, and in autumn acquires a particular character, becomes more insistent and more variable, comes in long gusts, followed by intervals of relative calm, in which you can hear things you could not hear during the gusting, the specific silence of the intervals as textured and as informative as the sound of the wind itself. The monk noted this rhythm of sound and interval with the ear of someone who had been listening to it for long enough that it had become the ambient music of his life, the background against which everything else occurred, so familiar that it was almost unheard, and yet always there. The way the heartbeat is always there, present enough to notice when you stop to listen, and present enough to provide its continuity even when you are not noticing. He noted the blackbird. There is always a blackbird in the early Irish nature poetry, which is not coincidence or aesthetic preference, but observation, because the blackbird of the Irish countryside is genuinely as present and as vocal and as particular in its insistence on being noticed as the tradition records it being. The blackbird in this poem was singing its evening song, which is the specific song that blackbirds sing in the late afternoon of autumn days when the light is failing. A song different in character from the morning song, less declarative, less concerned with boundary and assertion, more inward and more meditative. The song of a creature settling itself toward the night, finding its branch, adjusting its posture, letting the song come out not as a statement, but as the simple acoustic expression of an animal that is in its place and knows it is in its place, and sings from that knowledge without effort or intention. The monk heard this and wrote it down. He did not elaborate it. He did not draw from it a theological conclusion, or a metaphor for the spiritual life, or a lesson applicable to the conduct of human affairs. He simply recorded what he heard. The blackbird on its branch in the fading light above the Irish Sea, singing its evening song, and set it down on the parchment beside whatever official text he was copying. A marginal note, a small notation in the margin of a larger document, as if to say, without saying it, that this too belonged in the record, that this small, exact perception of a blackbird singing in the autumn evening deserved its place alongside whatever theological matter occupied the main body of the page. This is the thing that the early Irish nature poetry understood, that the early Irish mythological tradition understood in its larger and more elaborate way, that the lore of the fairy folk and the other world and the Dagda's harp and the Birds of Rhiannon, all expressed from their different angles and with their different scales of imagery. The thing that I have spent many hours in this archive trying to find the most accurate words for, and perhaps finding it now, in the quietness of this particular lamp, at this particular hour. Rest is not the absence of the world. Rest is the world perceived without the urgency of response. The blackbird singing in the fading light is the world. The wind against the stone walls of the monk's cell is the world. The hazelnuts falling into the sacred well and the 5 streams running outward from it, and the melodious sound of the water moving through the roots of very old trees. These are the world, and they do not require anything of the one who perceives them, except the perceiving, the simple and sufficient act of being a consciousness in the presence of something that is occurring, receiving it without the need to respond to it, without the need to manage it, or protect against it, or make of it something other than what it is. The other world that the ancient Irish imagined beyond the fairy mounds and beneath the western sea was not a world without experience. It was a world without the anxiety that makes experience difficult, the anxiety that turns every perception into a demand, every moment into a question of whether it should be accepted or resisted or changed. In the other world, the experiences continued, the music and the light and the taste of the inexhaustible feast and the sound of the well's 5 streams, but they were received without the filtering of anxiety, without the constant mediation of a nervous system that has been told it must always be ready to respond. And in the absence of that mediation, the experience of being present to things became what it always is when the mediation stops. Simply pleasant, simply sufficient, simply the natural condition of a creature in a world it has stopped fighting. The early monks on their rocky headlands understood this, and they wrote it down in the margins of their manuscripts, in poems so brief and so precise that they could be contained in a few lines, a few images, a few carefully chosen words that pointed without insisting, that offered without demanding, that said, "Here is this blackbird, here is this evening light, here is this wind and this water, and this particular quality of silence that lives inside the sound of the wind on a headland above the Atlantic on an autumn afternoon. And all of it is already everything, and none of it requires anything more of you than the simple, receiving, unhurried, grateful fact of your attention. The stone walls of the monastery absorbed the monk's attention across the years of his habitation, absorbed the quality of his looking and listening and writing down. And perhaps this is what stone walls do. Perhaps this is what the archive stone walls have done across the long years of my keeping of it. Absorbed the attention of every reader who has sat within them, and allowed that accumulated attention to become something like a presence, a warmth that is not temperature exactly, but is received by the body as something similar to warmth, the warmth of a place where thought has occurred and care has been exercised, and the slow, patient work of understanding has been undertaken across enough years that the walls themselves seem to participate in it, seem to hold in their stone the residue of all that long attention, the way old stone holds heat. Outside these walls, wherever outside is for the one hearing these words, the world is continuing in its way, its noise and its urgency and its demands persisting as they always persist, as they have always persisted, as they will persist until the morning light brings them back into their proper proportion, and they become, once again, simply the ordinary business of a life being lived in the world. But they are outside. They are on the other side of whatever wall exists between this moment and the moment before you arrived at this stillness. And the wall, while not impenetrable, is substantial enough for now, is sufficient to the purpose of this hour, which is simply and entirely rest. The Tuatha Dé Danann are in their hills. They have been there for longer than the counting of mortal years, continuing their ancient domestic existence in the warm interior of the Sí, the spinning and the weaving and the tending of whatever grows in the gardens of the hidden world, the particular flowers that bloom in a world that has no season but flowering, the particular light that falls from a sky that has no weather but warmth. They are very comfortable in there, in the old tradition, very settled and very unhurried. And the sound of them, if you are close enough to the right hill at the right hour of the right day, would be the sound of an existence that has found its peace and keeps it, that has made its accommodation with the world it inhabits, and rests in that accommodation with the ease of something that has been exactly where it is for a very long time. Oisín is on the white horse on the plain of flowers beneath the sea, the magmel spreading its blossoms in every direction without horizon, without end, without the anxiety of an ending, and the horse moves through it with that perfect, soundless fluidity. And Niamh's brightness is the light of a world that generates its own illumination. And the time is not passing exactly, not accumulating toward something, simply present, simply the fullness of itself, simply this moment of the white horse moving through the flowers beneath the sea, as complete in itself as any moment has ever been. Bran is somewhere to the west of Ireland, in the long Atlantic twilight, and the silver branch is in his hand, and its white blossoms drift in the air around him, and the music it makes when the sea wind moves through it is the music of the Suantraiges, played at its softest possible volume, the music that seems not to make a sound at all, and yet fills the air with the permission to rest, with the specific, unhurried, unconditional permission to rest. The Dagda's harp stands in the great hall of the Tuatha Dé Danann, in whatever dimension holds it, and the strings have stilled since the Suantraiges was last played. But the resonance of the playing has not entirely dissipated, the way the resonance of a bell does not entirely dissipate, but continues in frequencies too low for the ear to register consciously, continues in the body's response to something that was heard, and is still, in some way, being heard. And the birds of Rhiannon are singing. They are very far away, and they sound very close. They are very close, and they sound like they are coming from the far edge of the world, from the place where the world curves out of sight, and whatever continues beyond that curve continues without witnesses, continues in its own private way, the birds of Rhiannon singing to it regardless, singing without audience or approval, singing because singing is what they are and have always been, and will always be. The monk on his headland has set down his quill. The blackbird has finished its evening song and found its branch, and settled into the posture of a creature that is done for the day, that has given what it had to give to the day, and now requires only the branch and the dark and the ambient warmth of the earth, and the slow continuation of the night's long, patient keeping of all the things the day put down. And the archive. The archive is very still. The scroll is nearly at its end, and my hands hold it more gently now than they did at the beginning of the evening, with the lightened grip of a reader who has arrived somewhere, and can allow the arriving to simply be the arrival, without immediately reaching for the next thing, without converting the completion into a preparation for something further. The things in the scroll are back in their places now. The Aos Sí in their hills, the otherworld beyond its western horizon, the harp in its hall, the birds on whatever branch or wind current they have found in the in-between place where they live. They are all resting, after their fashion. They are all doing what the old tradition says they have always done in the hours between one telling and the next, which is simply to continue, quietly and without audience, in the world that the stories describe, and that the stories are perhaps not entirely distinct from. The lamp is very low now. The flame has become something between a flame and an ember, holding its small warmth close to itself, giving light only to what is immediately before it, and what is immediately before it is the last lines of the scroll, and the hands that hold the scroll, and the desk on which the hands rest, and the surrounding dark that has come close while the reading was happening, drawn in by the quality of the attention. The way darkness is always drawn in by the quality of the attention, filling the space that the waking mind vacates as it loosens its hold on the periphery and gathers itself gently toward the center. The cedar smell of the archive, the old leather of the scroll's cover, the dust of 1,000 years resting on the highest shelves, undisturbed by any current of air, settled there the way the finest things settle, the finest and lightest particles of all the time that has moved through this room, resting now on the surfaces of things, making everything they touch a little softer, a little more continuous with everything around it, a little more held in the general patient warmth of a very old place that has housed many hours of many nights and holds this one as it has held all the others. Gently, the tome is closing now, the heavy cover finding the last page and resting against it with the soft, final sound of old leather on old parchment. A sound the archive knows well, a sound that means the reading is complete, that what the words contained has been received, that the night can now do its own work, its slower and quieter and more essential work, the work that requires no lamp and no scroll and no voice, only the body in its stillness, only the breath in its rhythm, only the dark in its deep and ancient keeping. The ember of the lamp, glowing softly, the stone walls breathing their old breath around everything they have always held, the scroll at rest, the night continuing its vast and patient turning. All is ancient, all is quiet, all is held. Rest now, rest.